There are civilizations that once shone like the sun in a clear sky, brilliant, powerful, unforgettable, only to vanish, leaving behind scattered fragments in humanity's memory. Egypt, with its pyramids, Greece, with its philosophy, Rome, with its mighty empire, these are names etched forever into history. But hidden between those familiar pages lies another superpower, one that once held the ancient world in awe, then disappeared so completely that for thousands of years people nearly forgot they had ever existed. They were the Hittites, rulers of the great crossroads of Anatolia, signers of the oldest surviving peace treaty with Egypt, masters of war chariots and advanced metalwork. And then, almost without warning, they vanished from human memory. For centuries they lived on only as shadows in legend. Even as late as the 18th century, scholars still argued over whether the Hittites had ever truly existed. That changed when, from the ruins of Hattusa, their once glorious capital, archaeologists unearthed clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script. Suddenly another world came into focus, an empire that rivaled Egypt and Babylon, built on written law, skilled diplomacy, and trade networks stretching across the Near East. In tonight's episode of Bedtime History, we'll follow the trail of the Hittites to confront an age-old question. Why do some civilizations, despite reaching the heights of power on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, still fade away, swept from history, until even their names are almost forgotten? To answer those questions, we have to turn the clock back more than 3,000 years to the early centuries of the second millennium BCE. At that time, the land we now call Anatolia, or Asia Minor, wasn't a unified nation. Instead, it was a patchwork quilt of tribes and small kingdoms scattered across the highlands. This was a unique crossroads: to the west, the Aegean Sea; to the east, the Armenian highlands and Mesopotamia; to the south, Syria and Egypt; and to the north, the Black Sea. Anatolia was both a hub of trade routes and a meeting point for waves of migration, producing a landscape rich in diversity, but also rife with conflict. Indo-European groups from the north, possibly moving through the Caucasus, drifted into Anatolia in waves over centuries. Meanwhile, the native Hatti people had already lived there for generations, speaking a non-Indo-European language and practicing their own faith. To the east, the Hurrians expanded their influence from the mountains, while Assyrian merchants from the Tigris-Euphrates valleys set up trading outposts, known as Karum, across central and southern Anatolia. The most famous was at Kanesh, where archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform. These trade records give us the first glimpse of a bustling Anatolia, alive with commerce, ambition, and rivalry. In this environment of cultural mixing, the Hittites, one branch of the Indo-European newcomers, didn't erase local traditions. Instead, they absorbed and blended them. They borrowed cuneiform writing from the Sumerians and Akkadians for their administration. They took on Hurrian myths and rituals, and they preserved parts of the old Hatti religion. Out of this fusion was born the Hittite identity, Indo-European in roots, but deeply tied to the traditions of the Near East. It's why, when Hittite texts were finally deciphered in the 20th century, scholars were stunned to discover they were the earliest recorded Indo-European language known to us. From this diverse backdrop, a figure emerged, Anita, the ruler of Nesha, modern Kanesh, around the 18th century BCE. Anita left behind a remarkable text, often called the Proclamation of Anita, one of the oldest Indo-European writings ever discovered. In it he recorded his conquests, including the capture of Hattusa, the stronghold of the Hatti. He swore a solemn curse that no one should ever rebuild it. But history has a way of overturning such vows. Just a few generations later, Anita's own descendants broke the curse, choosing Hattusa as their capital and laying the foundation for the Hittite kingdom. Rebuilding Hattusa wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Perched high on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by rugged mountains, its massive stone and mud brick walls could withstand powerful armies. The city had abundant water and fertile land to sustain its people. From this vantage point, the Hittites could defend themselves and control the trade routes that cut across Anatolia. What began as a tribal settlement soon rose to become a center of power, the birthplace of the Hittite state. Once Hattusa became the capital and the beating heart of the Hittite kingdom, the kings of the Anatolian highlands knew one thing: to hold their place in a chaotic world, they needed weapons that would strike fear into their enemies. The Bronze Age was a time when military power determined the fate of entire peoples. Geography and stone walls could only protect so much. To stand alongside giants like Egypt, Mitanni, Babylon, and Assyria, the Hittites needed an edge. That edge came from two forces combined: advanced metalworking and a revolution in the art of the war chariot. Anatolia had long been rich in metal ores. Copper and tin, the ingredients of bronze, were available in lands the Hittites controlled or influenced. But what set them apart was their access to iron, a rare metal at the time, used mostly for ornaments or ceremonial objects. Archaeological finds show that Hittite smiths were among the first to master the secrets of iron, heating, hammering, and tempering it into blades sharper and stronger than bronze. Iron wasn't common enough to arm every soldier, but even a small elite force carrying these new weapons could change the balance of battle. On the field, bronze swords chipped and dulled quickly, while Hittite iron blades cut through bronze shields and armor, deadly in practice and terrifying in the minds of their opponents. But weapons were only half the story. The other half, and the symbol most feared across the ancient world, was the Hittite chariot. The Egyptians had chariots too, light and agile on the plains of the Nile, but the Hittites took the design further. They shifted the axle toward the back, giving the chariot better balance, even on rough terrain. Their six-spoked wheels were strong but light, and the standing platform was wide enough for 3 men. That one change made all the difference. Instead of just a driver and an archer, a Hittite chariot could also carry a third warrior armed with a spear or shield, ready for close combat. Suddenly, the chariot was no longer just a mobile archery platform. It became a versatile war machine, able to strike from a distance, shield its crew, and smash straight into enemy lines. From Hattusa, clay tablets preserve the Kikuli text, a horse training manual written by a Mitanni expert. It lays out in detail how to feed, exercise, and rest horses, even endurance routines for long campaigns. These records reveal not just professionalism in raising war horses, but also traces of ancient Indo-Aryan vocabulary, evidence of cultural exchange across the Indo-European world. Thanks to this knowledge, Hittite horses weren't just beasts of burden, they were trained athletes, capable of powering through long battles and grueling marches. Imagine it, hundreds of Hittite chariots charging into a valley, hooves thundering like rolling storms, wheels grinding into the earth, arrows raining down before the enemy could even form up. As panic spread, Hittite infantry moved in to finish the job. Their army wasn't just about brute force, it was coordinated. Chariots led the charge, archers blanketed the field, light cavalry chased the retreating, and infantry with spear and shield secured victory. The Hittites knew how to use the land too. Narrow passes, rugged plateaus, or open plains could all become the perfect stage for their tactics. It was an early form of combined arms warfare, centuries before most civilizations thought beyond simple, head-on clashes. Behind every victory stood a massive system of organization. To support thousands of warriors and hundreds of chariots, the Hittites had to run a tight operation. grain storehouses, smithies, stables, and supply lines stretching across their lands. Excavated tablets reveal conscription lists, ration records, mobilization orders, and even reward systems for soldiers. War forced the Hittites to build a sophisticated administrative machine, one that would later become the backbone of their empire. Their campaigns proved their strength. Kings like Hattusili I marching into Syria, or Mursili I striking as far as Babylon, showed the world that the Hittites could not be ignored. Once dismissed as highland barbarians, they stepped into the spotlight as equals to the greatest powers of the Bronze Age. On the battlefield, the three-man chariot and the cold edge of iron became their calling card. In diplomacy, their military might made them a voice no ruler could afford to overlook. For the Hittites, war wasn't just expansion. It was the force that shaped their state. It drove them to create systems, laws, and a society run not only on strength but also on organization and knowledge. And so every time a column of chariots thundered out from Hattusa, it wasn't only the start of a battle, it was a declaration to the world. The Hittites were ready to take their place among the true superpowers of their age. Once the Hittites had the military power to secure their place in the ancient world, they faced an even greater challenge: how to govern a vast territory where each region had its own traditions, beliefs, and way of life. Swords and chariots could win battles, but to sustain an empire across generations, they needed something stronger to bind people together. That bond was law. While many civilizations of the time still relied on the king's word or unwritten customs rooted in divine authority, the Hittites dared to create a system of clear, written laws pressed into clay for all to see and follow. This became one of the earliest law codes in history, second only to Hammurabi's code in Babylon. And yet, it revealed a very different philosophy of governance. Hammurabi's code is famous for its principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, harsh punishments meant to balance crime with equal retribution. The Hittite laws, on the other hand, were strikingly practical and even at times humane. In many cases, rather than cutting off a hand, executing someone, or enforcing brutal penalties, the Hittites preferred compensation. If one man injured another, he could repay the harm with silver, livestock, or labor. This preserved valuable workers in a farming and military society where every hand was needed. It also broke the endless cycle of blood feuds that could tear small communities apart. In a world shaken constantly by war, famine, and disease, every life mattered, and the Hittites seemed to understand this. Their laws touched nearly every corner of daily life: the division of farmland, property disputes, inheritance, marriage rights, and even rules about stolen animals and protection of crops. The goal wasn't just to enforce royal power, but to safeguard the stability of ordinary life, because only a secure society could support an army and empire. Even slavery, though still present, looked different under Hittite law. Slaves could own property and, in some cases, marry free people, offering a little more mobility than in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Morality and religion also found their place in the law. Adultery, for instance, didn't always mean execution. Sometimes it was resolved with fines or agreements, but not everything was lenient. Certain acts, like incest or bestiality, were punished severely, seen as threats to the moral and social fabric. The Hittites weren't abandoning the idea of right and wrong. Instead, they were prioritizing stability and social order over blind vengeance. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Hittite legal system was how it placed limits, even if modest, on the king and his officials. Though the king was supreme, the law stood as a reference point, curbing decisions that might otherwise depend on personal will alone. Some clauses even required officials to repay damages if they wronged a citizen. Of course, the laws weren't perfectly fair. Nobles still had privileges that peasants and slaves did not. But compared to their contemporaries, the idea of a shared justice system, one that bound even rulers, was extraordinary. This legal tradition didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew out of centuries of tribal conflict, when the Hittites learned through blood and hardship that only a shared framework of rules could hold their people together. The law became both the product of that history and the tool for unifying a diverse, multi-ethnic empire. When a tribe accepted Hittite law, it was also accepting the authority of Hattusa. Reading these clay tablets today, etched over 3,000 years ago, we can't help but be amazed. In an age where violence was the language of power, the Hittites chose a path of pragmatism and reconciliation. They were still a warrior society, still ruled by nobles, but they recognized that fairness, even if imperfect, could be the key to lasting order. Because of this legal foundation, Hattusa was not just a city of warriors and temples. It became an archive of thousands of documents, laws, treaties, disputes, resolved not by the sword but by the written word. From this base, the Hittites built not only a state strong in arms, but also a community that could function on trust in the law. It was a step forward that set them apart, and one that allowed their young empire to survive the violent storms of the Bronze Age, leaving us with a testament to humanity's search for order in even the most chaotic chapters of history. If military power and law gave the Hittite Empire its structure, then religion and myth were its soul. The Hittites proudly called their land the country of 1,000 gods, and that was no exaggeration. In the ancient world, every city, every village, even rivers and mountains had their own deities. But instead of erasing local beliefs or forcing a single state religion, the Hittites chose to blend and absorb. When they conquered new lands, they didn't destroy local temples. They welcomed those gods into their own pantheon. The result was a vast, diverse tapestry of deities, Hattian, Hurrian, Luwian, even Babylonian, coexisting under the same sacred sky. This flexibility reflected a wise political philosophy. The Hittites knew their empire stretched across many peoples and traditions. Forcing one faith might spark resistance, but honoring local gods gave communities a sense of continuity. At the same time, those gods were folded into a larger cosmic order, seen as different faces of the same divine power. Religion thus became more than worship. It was a tool of unity and politics. Every treaty included oaths sworn before the gods, with the belief that breaking the pact would bring divine punishment. Faith, in this way, underpinned both law and diplomacy. At Hattusa, the chief deities were the storm god Tahuna, often equated with the Hurrian god Teshub, and the sun goddess of Arina. Together they embodied rain, fertility, light, and justice. The Hittites believed that the storm god's rains and the sun goddess' warmth kept life flourishing. Alongside them stood hundreds of lesser deities, mountain gods, river gods, war gods, harvest gods, even spirits protecting specific places. It was a spiritual network as vast and varied as the empire itself. Hittite mythology preserved stories as powerful as their pantheon was vast. One tale tells of Telepinu, the god of agriculture. When anger drove him away, crops withered, livestock died, and people starved. Only when Telepinu was found and calmed did fertility return. This myth wasn't just about nature, it was a metaphor for the king's role. Just as Telepinu's presence meant abundance, so too did the king's just rule ensure the prosperity of his people. Another legend tells of Ilyanka, the chaos dragon defeated by the storm god, a theme echoing across Indo-European cultures, from Zeus and Typhon in Greece to Indra and Vritra in India. These myths reminded the Hittites that the world was always caught in the struggle between order and chaos, and it was humanity's duty to help preserve balance. If Hattusa was the political heart, then Yazilikaya was the spiritual heart of the empire. This open-air sanctuary carved into rock cliffs displayed processions of gods in long reliefs. 12 underworld gods marched in line. Storm gods, sun gods, and war gods stood together, and at the center the Hittite king appeared, embraced by the divine. Many scholars believe Yazilikaya also served as a cosmic calendar, recording cycles of time and astronomy while hosting the empire's most sacred rituals. Here, religion wasn't abstract belief, it was a visible symbol of royal power. One figure stands out in this religious landscape, Queen Puduhepa, in the 13th century BCE. Once a priestess of the Hurrian sun goddess, she became queen beside King Hattusili III. Puduhepa reorganized the Hittite pantheon, merging overlapping gods and bringing clarity to the empire's mythology. She also corresponded with Pharaoh Ramses II of Egypt, invoking the gods as witnesses to peace and friendship between the two powers. In her hands, religion became diplomacy. She was not just queen and priestess, but a political strategist who used faith to bind her empire internally and strengthen it abroad. Looking into the Hittite world of gods, we don't see a rigid system. Instead, we find a colorful mosaic reflecting cultural diversity and political skill. It was a faith of fusion where the gods of conquerors and the gods of the conquered shared the same temple. Myths explained the forces of nature, but they also legitimized royal authority. For the Hittites, belief was not only spiritual, it was the foundation that allowed a multi-ethnic empire to endure and hold together through the storms of the Bronze Age. With military power and religion forming the backbone of their empire, the Hittites soon faced the inevitable, direct clashes with the other great powers of their age. And on the map of the ancient Near East, no rival loomed larger than Egypt under the pharaohs. The land of Syria-Canaan, lying between the two empires, became the critical choke point. To control it meant to command the flow of trade, copper and tin from Anatolia, grain, cedarwood, and war horses from the Levant, and luxury goods arriving from the east. When Mitanni, the old buffer state in northern Syria, began to collapse, Egypt and the Hittites came face to face. Tensions flared with a mysterious episode known as the Dahamunzu affair. After the sudden death of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, the young queen, likely Ankhesenamun, sent a desperate letter to Suppiluliuma, the first of the Hittites. She asked him to send one of his sons to Egypt so she could marry him and preserve the throne. It was unprecedented, an Egyptian princess declaring she would not marry any of her own subjects and requesting a foreign prince instead. After some hesitation, Suppiluliuma agreed and sent Prince Zananza down the Nile. But the prince never arrived. He was murdered along the way. The affair shattered trust between the two kingdoms and set the stage for decades of hostility. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, one of the most famous battles of the Bronze Age. On one side stood Ramses II of Egypt, on the other Muwatalli II of the Hittites. Both marched massive armies toward the city of Kadesh on the banks of the Orontes River. Ramses, eager and misled by faulty intelligence, advanced his Amun division too far ahead, while the rest of his army lagged behind. It was exactly the opening Muwatalli had been waiting for. Thousands of Hittite chariots stormed down in a sudden, devastating ambush. The Egyptian camp was thrown into chaos, and only Ramses's stubborn defense, along with reinforcements that arrived just in time, prevented total disaster. The Egyptians later carved grand inscriptions on the walls of Karnak and Abu Simbel, portraying Ramses as a lone hero who turned the tide single-handedly. The Hittite records, in contrast, emphasized that they had held Kadesh and forced the Egyptians to retreat. The truth likely lay in between. Neither side won an outright victory, but the battle proved one thing: the Hittites were Egypt's equals. Egypt salvaged its honor, the Hittites held their ground, and Kadesh became less a story of conquest than a lesson in how history can be shaped as much by words as by weapons. What came afterward, however, was more significant than the battle itself. Both sides realized that endless war brought nothing but exhaustion. The Hittites faced growing pressure from Assyria in the east. Egypt was stretched thin, struggling to maintain far-flung influence in Syria while also dealing with Nubia in the south and unrest at home. In this climate, the two rivals made a decision that would echo through history: peace. Around 1259 BCE, under Hattusili III of the Hittites and Ramses II of Egypt, the two empires sealed a treaty. It was written in two versions, one in Akkadian cuneiform at Hattusa, the other in Egyptian hieroglyphs at Karnak. This was the earliest known surviving written peace treaty in the world. It didn't just declare an end to hostilities, it laid out a framework for alliance, mutual defense against outside attacks, extradition of fugitives and deserters, and, most importantly, an eternal oath of friendship sworn before the gods. A copy cast in silver, symbolizing permanence, was exchanged between the two courts. Today, a replica of that treaty hangs at the United Nations as a reminder of humanity's timeless yearning for peace. The treaty was more than words. To seal the pact, a Hittite princess was married to Ramses II, becoming a queen of Egypt. This wasn't just political convenience, it was recognition, an acknowledgement of equal power. Surviving diplomatic letters show Queen Puduhepa of the Hittites corresponding directly with Ramses, addressing him as brother. Their relationship carried both warmth and strategy, embodying a new balance between two former enemies. From the bloodshed of Kadesh to the shimmering Treaty of Silver, the Hittites revealed themselves not just as warriors with iron swords and three-man chariots, but as a superpower that knew when to fight, when to negotiate, and how to turn enemies into allies. In a world often ruled by vengeance and violence, this was a sign of political maturity. And it worked. The peace held for decades, allowing the Hittites to turn their gaze eastward toward the rising power of Assyria, which was about to transform the entire balance of Bronze Age. For an empire to endure, swords and chariots alone were never enough. No army could survive without food, metals, war horses, and the trade routes that kept the great machine behind it supplied. The Hittites understood early on that true power came not only from conquest, but from controlling the flow of goods, resources, and diplomacy. Alongside the battles that shook Syria and Egypt, they fought another war, quieter but just as decisive, the struggle to dominate the trade networks of the ancient Near East. Anatolia was rich in resources, but to become an empire, the Hittites had to look beyond their borders. Copper and silver could be mined locally, but tin, the critical ingredient for making bronze, was scarce and had to be imported from afar. For centuries, Assyrian merchants had carried tin from the east across thousands of miles to trade in colonies like Kanesh. Once strong enough, the Hittites didn't just inherit these routes, they seized control of them. To hold tin was to hold the keys to the Bronze Age itself, for without it the production of weapons would grind to a halt. Later, as iron from the Anatolian highlands grew more important, the Hittites' metallurgical skill gave them another decisive edge. Horses, too, were a strategic resource. The Anatolian plateau provided ideal pastures, and the Hittites quickly became a hub of horse breeding and training. Diplomatic letters found in Egypt's Amarna archives reveal kings from neighboring states pleading with the Hittite court to send them horses and chariots as royal gifts. This turned the Hittites into a horse superpower, supplying material strength while also using horses as leverage. A minor King Canaan might dream of defying Hattusa, but if his cavalry depended on Hittite stock, rebellion suddenly looked far less attractive. From the capital of Hattusa, trade routes stretched in every direction. Eastward, they reached Mesopotamia and the far-off tin mines of Iran. Westward, they connected to the Aegean and the Mycenaean world. Southward, they ran through Syria to ports like Byblos, Ugarit, and Carchemish, where cedar wood, glass, ivory, perfumes, and wine flowed in from across the Mediterranean. By controlling these choke points, the Hittites acted like gatekeepers, deciding who could pass and at what cost. Many treaties included explicit clauses on trade, not only to prevent war, but to secure mutual prosperity. This prosperity was visible in everyday life. Clay tablets preserve contracts for loans, sales, and even interest payments in silver or livestock. Villages around Hattusa raised cattle, sheep, and goats, cultivated wheat, barley, grapes, and olives, and delivered their surplus into state granaries. The central government collected taxes in kind, stored them, and redistributed food to soldiers and craftsmen. The entire economy revolved like a wheel. Farmers produced, the state collected and managed, the army and merchants extended Hittite influence. Yet the Hittites weren't only masters of war, they were skilled in the art of soft power. When necessary, they used gifts, gold, horses, or royal brides to strengthen alliances. If a Syrian city-state hesitated between Egypt and Hattusa, the Hittite king might send lavish gifts, promises of protection, and a treaty sworn before the gods. In a world where divine oath carried more weight than any piece of parchment, this strategy proved remarkably effective. Surviving letters from Amarna and Hattusa reveal a tone both commanding and intimate, kings addressing each other as brother, exchanging tokens of goodwill, while beneath the pleasantries lay sharp calculations of power. A striking example was Hittite relations with Ugarit, a wealthy port on the Mediterranean. Rather than conquering it by force, the Hittites made Ugarit a vassal state, allowing its king wide autonomy in exchange for loyalty and tribute. This arrangement let Hattusa reap the benefits of maritime trade without expending armies to rule directly. It was a clever strategy, turning commerce into a chain that bound the empire together without bloodshed. But prosperity carried risks. An empire built too heavily on trade and resources could become hostage to them. If routes were disrupted by war, migration, or natural disaster, the entire system might falter, and that in time was exactly what would unravel the Bronze Age world. But during their golden age, by mastering trade and wielding it as both lifeline and weapon, the Hittites showed that an empire could thrive not only by the sword, but by the subtle power of exchange, obligation, and persuasion. If military power and trade formed the backbone of the Hittite Empire, then culture, art, and writing were its soul, the part that endured long after the empire itself disappeared. Among the tens of thousands of clay tablets discovered at Hattusa, one truth stands out. The Hittites were among the first peoples to transform collective memory into written word, and that act allowed their world to step out of the shadows of time. The Hittite language belonged to the Indo-European family, and when it was finally deciphered in the early 20th century, it stunned scholars. It turned out to be the oldest recorded Indo-European tongue, predating Greek and Latin by centuries. The Hittites themselves called it Nesili, the language of Nesha, tying their identity back to the city of Kanesh, where their kingdom began. They wrote it using cuneiform, borrowed from the Akkadians and impressed onto clay. But that wasn't their only script. They also carved Luwian hieroglyphs onto stone and city walls, creating a dual writing system, practical for administration, symbolic for ceremony. This flexibility reflected their genius. They didn't reinvent writing from scratch, but adopted and reshaped what they needed. Hittite culture also thrived through art and architecture. At Hattusa, massive fortification walls still stand, their gates decorated with lions, warriors, and mythic creatures. The Lion Gate, the Warrior Gate, and the Sphinx Gate testify to a style that was at once realistic and symbolic. Animals carved not only for beauty, but to represent strength, protection, and royal power. At Yazilakia, their open-air sanctuary, gods march in endless processions across rock reliefs, one of the Bronze Age's most remarkable artistic legacies. Here we see a true cultural mosaic, Hattian, Hurrian, and Luwian deities all immortalized together in stone. But Hittite art was never just about aesthetics, it was political and spiritual propaganda. Carvings of kings standing alongside gods, or cradled in divine embrace, were messages etched in stone. The ruler's authority was sanctioned by heaven itself. In this way, art became both sacred symbol and royal proclamation. Music and ritual were just as essential. Hymns and liturgies have survived on clay tablets, many connected to agriculture, fertility, and offerings to the gods. Festivals brought together music, wine, dance, and sacrifice, transforming worship into both community celebration and political theatre. Every prayer, song, and offering was part of a carefully choreographed performance to secure harmony between the human and divine. One remarkable feature of Hittite culture was their role as preservers of other civilizations' knowledge. In the archives of Hattusa, archaeologists uncovered copies of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hurrian myths. The Hittites didn't hesitate to borrow, record, and safeguard the intellectual treasures of their neighbors. In doing so, they turned their capital into a library of the Bronze Age. Without their careful preservation, many Mesopotamian stories might have been lost forever. All of this reveals a side of the Hittites often overshadowed by their armies and laws. They were also a people of memory, storytellers, archivists. And it's thanks to the thousands of tablets they left behind that we can reconstruct their world in such vivid detail today. Without this written legacy, the Hittites might have survived only as a faint echo in the Bible, a blurred shadow swallowed by myth. But through their words, their carvings, their architecture, they resisted oblivion and stepped back into history's light. Hittite culture then carries an eternal weight. It proves that the strength of an empire is measured not only in what it conquers, but in what it records, remembers, and passes on. Because of that legacy, the Hittites are remembered not just as warriors with iron swords and three-man chariots, but as a civilization that helped write some of the very first chapters of humanity's shared story. When an empire reaches its height, the road ahead is rarely paved with endless triumphs. More often, it's marked by subtle fractures from within. For the Hittites, their rapid expansion in the 15th and 14th centuries BCE transformed them from a highland kingdom into one of the superpowers of the Bronze Age. But the very process of growth also sowed tensions, succession struggles, deepening social divisions, and local revolts that constantly threatened the empire's stability. From the very beginning, kings like Hattusili I and Mursili I launched bold campaigns pushing south and east, even once striking as far as Babylon, sending shockwaves through Mesopotamia. These victories brought glory and wealth, but they also created a problem: a vast, multi-ethnic empire stretching across diverse lands, each with its own traditions and interests. Governing such a patchwork was never easy. Whenever the central authority weakened, vassals and distant city-states looked for ways to break free, or to switch allegiance to rival powers like Egypt or Assyria. Even within the royal court, the throne was a source of constant strife. Kings were often deposed not by foreign enemies, but by their own brothers, sons, or nephews. Clay tablets record oaths of loyalty sworn by nobles and generals before the gods, promising faithfulness to the king and his heirs. But those oaths were often broken when power began to waver. In the 16th century BCE, King Telepinu issued a famous edict attempting to establish clear succession rules to end the bloodshed. Yet history shows those laws were rarely honored. Even under divine witness, the Hittite throne remained fragile. Society itself grew more stratified as the empire expanded. At the top stood the king, believed to embody the storm god and sun goddess, and alongside him the queen, who in some cases wielded political power equal to her husband, as Queen Puduhepa did later on. Beneath them were nobles and generals controlling land, slaves, and armies. At the base were farmers, craftsmen, and slaves shouldering taxes and labor obligations. While the law offered some measure of fairness, privilege always tilted toward the elite. Over time, this imbalance widened into a social burden, creating distance between the imperial center and the provinces. Military expansion also stretched the empire dangerously thin. To the south, the Hittites had to hold Syria against Egyptian influence. To the east, Assyria was rising, a younger power but increasingly aggressive. To the west, Luwian groups and the Mycenaeans along the Aegean coast posed threats of their own. An empire forced to maintain large armies on multiple fronts, while fractured within, was bound sooner or later to face crisis. Clay tablets from Hattusa record evidence of rebellions. Syrian vassals such as Amuru or Ugarit occasionally turned their backs on Hattusa, seeking Egyptian protection instead. Even regions closer to the capital sometimes saw nobles rise in revolt against the crown. Each uprising demanded costly campaigns to suppress, trapping the empire in a cycle of unrest and retribution. And yet the Hittites had an extraordinary capacity to recover from crisis. Time and again, they rebuilt order through law, religion, and diplomacy. Suppiluliuma I in the 14th century BCE is a prime example. Rising in the midst of chaos, he reconquered Syria, toppled Mitanni, and lifted the Hittites to the peak of their power. Leaders like him allowed the empire to endure for generations longer, even as its internal cracks widened. The story of Hittite expansion is one of paradox. The farther they reached outward, the more they fractured within. The more lands and peoples they ruled, the harder it became to demand absolute loyalty. And those inner conflicts, combined with the unrelenting pressures of foreign rivals, created a ticking time bomb, one that would eventually explode in the storms of the late Bronze Age collapse. In the memory that survives, the Hittites stand as both conquerors and cautionary tale. They remind us of a timeless truth: the higher power rises, the more fragile it becomes to the cracks that spread quietly from within. And if those cracks are left untended, they can grow wide enough to sweep away an entire dynasty into the silence of history. While the Hittites were rising as a Bronze Age superpower, another force in the east was quietly gathering strength: Assyria. At first, Assyria was little more than a small city-state on the banks of the Tigris, thriving on trade and surviving under the shadow of larger empires like Mitanni and Babylon. But over time, the Assyrians forged a disciplined military, a tightly controlled administration, and an ambition to expand that rivaled anyone. If the Hittites were known for their chariots and cultural adaptability, the Assyrians became infamous for their brutality and iron discipline. And when these two powers finally collided, the political map of the Near East began to shift. In the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Mitanni still dominated northern Mesopotamia, acting as a buffer between the Hittites and Assyria. But when Suppiluliuma I crushed Mitanni and turned it into a vassal, he also opened the door to direct contact and direct conflict with Assyria. At first, the Assyrians were weaker, but they seized every opportunity. Whenever the Hittites were distracted fighting Egypt in Syria, Assyria pushed outward, carving into lands once claimed by Hattusa. Assyria's style of rule differed sharply from that of the Hittites. The Hittites preferred soft power, treaties, sworn before the gods, political marriages, and granting vassal states like Ugarit or Carchemish a degree of autonomy in exchange for loyalty. The Assyrians, by contrast, favored naked force, their armies drilled with iron discipline, conquered with ruthless efficiency. Where the Hittites might negotiate, the Assyrians imposed. They often turned captured cities into provinces, installing central governors and taxing directly. It was effective for control, but it bred deep resentment. The clashes between Hittite and Assyria weren't always great set-piece battles. More often they were drawn-out contests along contested frontiers, the valleys of the Tigris and the upper reaches of Mesopotamia. Clay tablets record treaties, complaints, and accusations, each side claiming the other had broken agreements, seized land, or harbored defectors. It was a tug-of-war of power where neither side could destroy the other, but both slowly wore each other down. The irony is striking. In the 13th century BCE, the Hittites stood at their zenith, while Assyria was still only in the early stages of building an empire. Hattusa could dictate terms, and Assyria had to tread carefully, but over time the balance shifted. Assyria's stable internal structure allowed it to build steadily, while the Hittites were consumed by rebellions, succession disputes, and wars on multiple fronts. That difference was crucial. The Assyrians advanced slowly but surely, while the Hittites blazed brightly and burned out quickly. The rivalry between the two also highlights the broader transformation of power in the region. In the 14th century BCE, the Hittites set the rules of the game, standing shoulder to shoulder with Egypt and Babylon. But by the 12th century BCE, as the Hittite Empire faltered, Assyria rose to take its place, emerging as the new master of Mesopotamia in the Iron Age. In other words, the fall of the Hittites and the rise of Assyria were two sides of the same historical shift. One star dimmed and another flared to dominance. Looking back, the contrast between them is striking. The Hittites built bridges, absorbing cultures, binding allies through treaties, weaving diversity into their empire. The Assyrians built an engine of fear, punishment, conquest, and absolute central control. One acted as a mediator between East and West, the other a war machine grinding everything in its path. Together their clash of styles created powerful currents that reshaped the entire political landscape of the ancient Near East. No empire lasts forever. For the Hittites, collapse didn't come from a single battle or one enemy alone. It was the result of a storm of upheavals that swept across the entire Mediterranean and Near East at the end of the Bronze Age. In the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, great civilizations that had once flourished, Mycenae in Greece, Egypt under its new kingdom pharaohs, and Ugarit on the Syrian coast, were all shaken by crisis. In this wider cataclysm, the Hittite Empire, already fractured by internal tensions, proved especially vulnerable. One of the most direct blows came from the mysterious groups known in history as the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain debated. Some theories trace them to the Aegean, others see them as displaced populations driven by famine, war, or natural disaster. They moved in great waves, entire communities traveling by sea, warriors, women, children, descending on the coasts from Anatolia to Egypt. The Sea Peoples were both invaders and desperate migrants, and that dual nature made them nearly unstoppable. They fought fierce battles, but also shattered the trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age world. When vital ports like Ugarit were destroyed, the Hittites lost their lifelines. Tin for bronze weapons, timber for chariots, grain to feed the population and army all vanished with the collapse of maritime trade. Cut off from these arteries, the heart of Hattusa began to falter. Meanwhile, to the east, Assyria grew stronger by the year. Slowly but relentlessly they pressed into Hittite-controlled territories. Unlike the sudden storms of the Sea Peoples, the Assyrians were patient, expansionist, disciplined, and determined to claim fertile lands piece by piece. While the Hittites strained to contain revolts and crises on their western and southern fronts, Assyria closed its grip on the east. The empire was caught in a vice, external pressure from both directions, and internal decay from within. Hattusa, once a mighty fortress with towering walls, slid into exhaustion. The clay tablets stopped being written, a sign that the administrative machine had broken down. Archaeological evidence suggests the city was burned around 1200 BCE. Charred ruins and blackened walls still bear witness to its violent end. Who set it ablaze? Was it an enemy invasion or the city's own people in revolt? We may never know for certain, but the outcome is clear. A capital that had once forced Egypt to sign a treaty of peace lay in ashes, its voice silenced. When Hattusa went up in flames around 1200 BCE, it seemed as if Hittite history had ended forever. And yet, from the ashes, a chain of smaller kingdoms survived in southern Anatolia and northern Syria, keeping alive the final spark of a once mighty civilization. These are known today as the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, bridges between the fallen Bronze Age world and the dawning Iron Age. The most prominent was Carchemish, a city on the banks of the Euphrates. Once a loyal vassal of Hattusa, Carchemish now rose as its heir. Its kings still called themselves Hittite, still carved inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs, and still depicted themselves alongside the storm god and the sun goddess on stone monuments. The message was clear: the Hittites had not vanished entirely. Surrounding Carchemish, a constellation of small states emerged: Kumu, Melid, Gurgum, Tabal, and Kwe, wedged between rising powers like Assyria, the Arameans, and Urartu. These states survived through flexible diplomacy, sometimes submitting, sometimes allying, sometimes rebelling, to regain independence. Though small, they preserved distinct Hittite traditions in their art and rituals. Reliefs from sites like Zincherli and Karatepe, carved in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, depict banquets, gods, and battles, Hittite in spirit, yet blended with Aramean and Phoenician influences. They are proof that Hittite culture didn't disappear, but flowed into the wider mosaic of the Near East. Language, too, tells the story of survival. The Hittite tongue, written in cuneiform, vanished with Hattusa, but Luwian hieroglyphs continued to be carved on stone monuments for centuries, preserving echoes of a lost empire and helping modern scholars trace the transition from the Hittite kingdom to these successor states. Eventually, the tide of history caught up. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Carchemish, Kumu, and their neighbors fell one by one to the kings of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and their successors. On the political map, the Hittites were erased. Yet their influence lived on. Assyrian palaces borrowed motifs and sculptural styles from Hittite art, proof that even the conquerors absorbed something from the culture they destroyed. Their mythology, too, left traces far beyond Anatolia. Tales of the storm god battling a dragon, or of the vanished deity whose absence wrought famine, spread into Syria, into Greek mythology, and even into the Bible. Some scholars argue that the Old Testament's imagery of demons and chaos draws partly from Hittite Hurrian myth. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms eventually faded under Assyrian rule, but they were like glowing embers after a great fire, small but still shining. From that dim light, the Hittites left behind a lasting legacy, etched not only in stone, but in the cultural memory of humanity itself. The Hittite Empire did not exist in isolation. It was part of a vast and interconnected world of the Bronze Age. To truly understand them, we can't just picture their chariots, thundering across the Anatolian highlands or the massive walls of Hattusa. We have to place them within a web of exchanges, alliances, and rivalries stretching from the Nile to the Aegean, from Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau. The Hittites were a crucial link in that chain, both a bridge between East and West, and one of the earliest architects of what we might call an international order. By the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, this ancient world had coalesced into what historians often describe as a club of superpowers. Its members included Egypt in the south, Babylon and Assyria in the east, Mitanni, and later the Hittites in Anatolia, and wealthy city-states like Ugarit, Byblos, and Carchemish in Syria. Canaan. These states didn't just fight, they also exchanged letters, gifts, and royal marriages. In Egypt's Amarna archive, hundreds of cuneiform letters have been found in which kings addressed each other as brother, trading princesses, gold, silver, horses, and luxury goods. Thanks to its strategic position, the Hittite kingdom quickly earned a seat at this table of equals. That meant that alongside battles like Kadesh, the Hittites were deeply involved in a kind of court diplomacy on a scale the world had never seen before. Hittite kings wrote to pharaohs, corresponded with Babylonian rulers, and received gifts from Cyprus and the Aegean. Envoys and merchants traveled constantly, carrying not only goods but also news, ideas, and technologies. Through these networks, chariot warfare, metallurgical techniques, myths, and rituals spread across entire regions. The Hittites were both recipients and transmitters, positioned at the very center of an increasingly connected world. In trade, their role was indispensable. Controlling Anatolia with its copper, silver, and iron ores, and the routes leading to distant tin sources in the east, they became the gatekeepers of the era's most vital resource. Bronze, the foundation of the age, depended on tin, and Egypt, Babylon, and Mycenae all relied on routes overseen by the Hittites. This made them not only a military power, but also an economic one. But it wasn't only goods that moved along these routes, it was knowledge. In the royal archives of Hattusa, archaeologists uncovered copies of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hurrian myths, along with texts on medicine and divination from Mesopotamia. The Hittites didn't just borrow, they preserved. Their capital became a kind of library for the ancient world. Without their copies, many stories might have been lost forever. The myth of Iluyanka, the storm god's battle with the dragon, may have fed into Greek motifs. Hurrian rituals survived thanks to Hittite records. Indo-Aryan terms in horse training manuals revealed deep ties to Mitanni. Hattusa was more than a capital, it was a storehouse of a shared Bronze Age culture. In this interconnected world, war and diplomacy were two sides of the same coin. The Battle of Kadesh, one of history's most famous clashes, directly produced the Silver Treaty, the earliest surviving international peace treaty. It proved that the great powers of the Bronze Age knew not only how to fight, but also how to negotiate and create shared rules to limit conflict. The agreement did not prevent eventual collapse, but it stands as one of humanity's earliest experiments in global governance. Placed in this wider context, the Hittites were far more than a regional empire. They were pillars of the first international system in human history. They managed trade networks spanning thousands of miles, exchanged princesses and treasures with pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings, and preserved the myths and knowledge of many peoples. Through these connections, the Hittites were not confined to Anatolia. They were present in the entire story of the Bronze Age. Their fall, then, was not just their own tragedy. It was part of a global storm that swept away some of the brightest civilizations of the ancient world. But within that storm, the Hittites' central role stands out, a reminder that even in humanity's earliest days, people were already weaving a shared world and already facing the risks of being bound together. When people think about the fall of the Hittite Empire, The first images that come to mind are usually war, conflicts with Assyria, or the devastating raids of the Sea Peoples. But today, thanks to archaeology and climate science, we know there was another enemy, an invisible one but no less deadly: nature itself. Shifts in climate, prolonged droughts, famine, and the scarcity of resources played a crucial role in pushing the Hittites, and many other Bronze Age civilizations, toward collapse. The Anatolian plateau was never as fertile as the Nile Delta or the plains of Mesopotamia. Winters were harsh, summers were dry, and farming was always a challenge. To sustain a massive capital like Hattusa, the Hittites depended heavily on granaries and shipments of grain from Syria and other regions. When everything worked smoothly, the empire could feed tens of thousands of people and soldiers. But when the climate turned, the entire system could unravel in an instant. Recent studies of tree rings and lake sediments from Anatolia and the Near East reveal that, toward the end of the 13th century BCE, the region suffered a decades-long drought. Rainfall diminished, crops failed, and rivers dried up. This wasn't a short-term setback, it was a regional climate event that struck Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and even Greece at the same time. For the Hittites, it was devastating. The last surviving clay tablets from Hattusa record desperate pleas to Egypt for shipments of grain. An empire that had once signed treaties with Ramses II was now reduced to begging for bread. It was a tragic image of how completely they depended on nature's cycles. Famine did more than starve the population, it crippled the military. Without food, horses died, chariots stood idle, and soldiers deserted. Empty granaries weakened loyalty among nobles and vassals, many of whom turned instead to Assyria, where conditions were more stable. Hunger became the wedge that split apart the fragile bonds holding a multi-ethnic empire together. Natural disasters struck at trade as well. Drought reduced agricultural surpluses, disrupting supply lines from Syria and the Levant. Ugarit, the wealthy port that had once been a hub of Mediterranean commerce, was destroyed by the Sea Peoples at the very moment climate stress peaked. With that, the Hittites lost access to the timber, grain, and tin they needed to keep their war machine running. Cut off from their lifelines, they spiraled further into crisis. And nature's impact wasn't just material, it was spiritual. In a society where gods were believed to control the rain and the harvest, repeated crop failures could be seen as divine anger. Rituals and sacrifices that failed to bring relief shook people's faith. Kings, supposed to be the intermediaries between gods and men, found their legitimacy undermined. Political authority eroded as surely as the crops withered in the fields. Some scholars suggest earthquakes may also have played a part in the widespread collapse of the Bronze Age. Anatolia sits on complex fault lines, and there is evidence of seismic activity around 1200 BCE. A series of earthquakes could have toppled cities, destroyed irrigation, and deepened the despair of already starving populations. In a system already under immense strain, nature only needed to give one final push. Seen through this lens, the disappearance of the Hittites becomes less a story of military defeat and more a lesson in humanity's vulnerability to the natural world. No matter how advanced their iron swords, their three-man chariots, or their mighty fortresses, they still depended on wheat, spring rains, and flowing rivers. When those foundations failed, their empire collapsed like a sandcastle before the tide. And one of history's cruelest ironies, just as the Hittites reached their moment of greatest power, nature turned against them, an enemy they could neither fight nor conquer. If drought and natural disaster were the invisible forces eroding the Hittite economy and faith, plague was the sudden blade that struck straight at the heart of the empire. In the ancient world, where medicine was rudimentary and belief in the gods outweighed scientific knowledge, disease was not just a health crisis, it was a social and political earthquake. For the Hittites, at least two major epidemics left deep scars on their history, weakening an empire already stretched thin. The first came during the reign of Suppiluliuma I, the great conqueror who lifted the Hittite kingdom to the height of its power in the 14th century BCE. After defeating Mitanni and expanding deep into Syria, he seemed invincible. But victory brought with it a deadly curse. As Hittite troops moved through the Levant, they carried home an unfamiliar disease, possibly plague. Clay tablets record soldiers returning to Hattusa with what they called the Black Death, spreading it through the population. The consequences were catastrophic: thousands dead, economic life paralyzed, and even Suppiluliuma himself fell victim. His sudden death, followed quickly by his heir, Arnawanda II, threw the royal court into turmoil and opened a period of instability. The epidemic didn't burn out quickly, it lingered for decades. Surviving clay tablets from the reign of Mursili II, Suppiluliuma's younger son, contain desperate prayers to the gods. In them, he laments that the plague had ravaged the land for more than 20 years, killing countless people. He begged the storm god and the sun goddess for forgiveness, searching for a divine cause. Was it his father's sin in attacking sacred lands, or a broken oath left unatoned? These prayers, both religious text and historical record, reveal the depth of despair the epidemic brought to king and people alike. Imagine an empire so dependent on agricultural and military labor suddenly losing farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers in vast numbers. Granaries, already strained by drought, emptied faster, with fewer hands to fill them. The proud Hittite army, once feared for its chariots and iron swords, was crippled as troops died or deserted. Even the royal court was not spared. When kings and crown princes themselves succumbed, the line of succession fractured, fueling infighting and political chaos. The disease may not have been confined to the Hittites alone. Some evidence suggests it spread across Egypt and the Levant as well. Letters from the Amarna archive mention fears of plague. In a world knit together by trade and war, disease traveled as swiftly as goods. The same networks that had enriched the Hittites now became conduits of death. Modern science has begun to shed light on this ancient catastrophe. DNA recovered from ancient human remains in Anatolia, and the Levant shows traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind plague, dating to this very period. If correct, then the Hittites may have endured one of humanity's earliest great plague outbreaks, centuries before the Black Death swept through medieval Europe. Whether it was plague or another epidemic, its impact was undeniable. Walls and chariots could hold back foreign enemies, but not an invisible one carried in the bloodstream. Disease didn't just kill, it broke faith. When sacrifices and prayers failed to end the suffering, people began to question their gods. And with that doubt, the authority of the king, believed to be the god's chosen intermediary, was shaken as well. In a society where religion and politics were inseparable, this erosion of faith was as destructive as any invading army. Looking back, plague emerges as a silent central factor in the Hittites' decline. It did not burn Hattusa like enemy torches, nor cut trade like the Sea Peoples, but it hollowed the empire from within. It sapped strength slowly, making recovery harder and harder. And in the clay tablets filled with Mursili II's desperate prayers, we can still hear the faint echoes of a people battling an enemy they could never defeat. In the final centuries of the Bronze Age, the ancient world wasn't shaken only by war, natural disaster, and plague. It was also transformed by massive waves of migration. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of communities abandoned their homelands, setting out in search of new lands where survival might be possible. In that great tide of movement, the Hittite Empire was both victim and participant. These migrations and forced resettlements reshaped the fragile social fabric of the Hittite world. The root causes of these migrations were often food shortages and political instability. Prolonged droughts and failed harvests forced people to leave barren lands in search of fertile ground and reliable water. Cities destroyed by war or trade networks severed by chaos left entire groups without the means to sustain themselves. And so, many of these migrant groups were not just wandering families, they became semi-military bands, moving as they fought, raiding as they searched for a place to settle. For the Hittites, migration pressed in from every direction. From the west, groups from the Aegean, possibly the ancestors of the Sea Peoples, pushed into the Anatolian coasts, threatening Hittite port cities. From the south, Aramean tribes and nomadic groups advanced into Syria, filling the vacuum left as Hittite power weakened. Even within Anatolia itself, long loyal vassal communities began slipping away from central control, seeking to re-establish their own autonomy. A kingdom built on the loyalty of vassals now found that loyalty unraveling. Migration didn't just fracture politics, it reshaped society itself. Newcomers brought their own gods, languages, and customs, often clashing with local traditions. At times, these tensions exploded into rebellion, forcing Hattusa to waste precious resources on costly campaigns to suppress uprisings. Yet migration also had a dual effect. Alongside conflict, it produced cultural blending. Faiths and traditions mingled, creating a diverse society that in some ways reflected the Hittites' long-standing talent for absorption and fusion. There was another layer, forced resettlement. To control territory and secure labor, Hittite kings often relocated entire populations. After campaigns in Syria, thousands of captives were brought back to Anatolia as slaves or farmers. These people added manpower, but they were also a tool of control, planted in border regions to secure loyalty. Yet this policy planted seeds of unrest. Resettled communities never fully accepted their new role. They carried memories of defiance, ready to rebel the moment the empire faltered. By the late 13th century BCE, the combination of incoming migrants and internal fragmentation had turned the Hittite social map into a shattered mosaic. Once loyal cities looked for new allies. Communities that had been forcibly resettled seized opportunities to revolt. Foreign groups claimed fertile lands and disrupted trade routes. All the ties that once held the empire together came undone. This is why, when Hattusa finally fell, the empire could not be rebuilt. Without its capital, there was no unified core to rally around. Vassals and small states went their own way, many falling under the sway of Assyria or Aramean tribes. Carchemish held on to fragments of Hittite tradition, but these were only faint embers, not enough to rekindle the great fire of empire. Seen more broadly, migration and resettlement were not unique to the Hittites. They were part of a global phenomenon that contributed to the widespread collapse of the Bronze Age. Anonymous waves of people pushed ancient superpowers into crisis, while at the same time laying the foundations of a new Iron Age world. The Hittites, through their collapse, became part of that turning point, a reminder that no empire can stand apart from the movement of peoples, and that human migration has always been one of the great forces driving history. As the Hittite Empire entered its death throes, it was not alone. At the close of the 13th and dawn of the 12th century BCE, the entire Mediterranean and Near East were engulfed in one of history's greatest crises, a wave of collapse that toppled civilization after civilization. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. When we widen the lens, we see that the fall of the Hittites was just one piece of a much larger tragedy, in which the brightest powers of the age fell into ruin. In the south, Egypt, under Ramses III, faced relentless waves of attack from the Sea Peoples. Inscriptions and reliefs on the walls of Medinet Habu depict hundreds of ships approaching the Nile Delta, crowded not only with warriors but also with women, children, and livestock. These were not just raiders, they were whole communities on the move. Egypt, with its fertile Nile and strong military machine, survived. Ramses III boasted that he had crushed the sea peoples, and indeed, Egypt did not fall as the Hittites or Ugarit had. But the wounds were deep. Trade networks broke, the economy weakened, and Egypt withdrew within its Nile borders, never again the far-reaching superpower it once had been. To the west, the Mycenaean civilization of Greece, famed for its fortified cities like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, collapsed in the same storm. Archaeology at Pylos shows a palace destroyed by fire around 1200 BCE, almost the same moment that Hattusa fell. The final Linear B tablets mention preparations for war, fleets mustering against unknown enemies, perhaps the Sea Peoples, perhaps other migrant groups. Whatever the threat, the Mycenaeans could not withstand it. Their palace system fell apart, and Greece descended into a dark age that lasted centuries before the rebirth of classical Greece. In the Levant, prosperous ports like Ugarit, once loyal allies of the Hittites, shared the same fate. Letters found in Ugarit describe the king begging for help. The enemy has come, the ships have arrived, and we have no more troops to defend ourselves. The plea came too late. Ugarit was burned to the ground, never to rise again. Its treasure troves of trade, once linking Anatolia, Egypt, and the Aegean, were erased overnight. With the destruction of these ports, the Hittites lost vital arteries of their own economy and supply. Even Babylon, long a symbol of continuity, was shaken. Mesopotamia fragmented into instability, just as Assyria rose in the north to fill the void. The old Bronze Age order, in which a handful of great powers dominated and sustained an interconnected world, was breaking apart. Seen as a whole, this was no series of isolated disasters, but a chain reaction. Climate shifted, famine spread, migrations began. Migrants struck at cities and ports, cutting trade routes. With economies shattered, armies could no longer be sustained, and once the armies faltered, even the mightiest walled cities could not stand. The collapse of the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, and the weakening of Egypt were not separate tragedies, but fragments of the same global storm. And in that storm, the Hittites stand out as a defining example. They were the bridge between East and West, the power that signed treaties with Egypt, the empire that controlled tin routes and war horses. Yet it was this central position that made them most vulnerable. When Ugarit fell, when the Sea Peoples swept through Syria, when drought withered Anatolia's fields, the Hittites were the first to collapse. They could not retreat into a single river valley like Egypt, nor survive in isolation behind mountains. They stood at the crossroads of the world, and when the world itself shook, they fell with it. The storm of the 12th century BCE was more than the fall of one empire, it was the end of an entire system. A great age closed, and out of its ashes a new one began, the Iron Age. Here, new powers like Assyria and later classical Greece would rise to dominate. But before that dawn could come, the world had to pass through the twilight of its brightest civilizations as the suns of the Bronze Age set together. The strangest thing about the Hittites is not only how powerful they once were, but how completely they disappeared from human memory for more than 2,000 years. While Egypt remained famous for its towering pyramids and sphinxes, while Babylon and Assyria lived on in the Bible and in Greek accounts, the Hittites were reduced to a faint echo, mentioned only in scattered verses of Hebrew scripture. Medieval and early modern scholars debated whether the Hittites were even real or just a mistranslation. An empire that had once signed treaties as equals with Egypt, that had ruled from Anatolia to Syria, was erased so thoroughly it was as if it had never existed. That silence lasted until the 19th century, when explorers and archaeologists began to take interest in the strange ruins of central Anatolia. In 1834, French architect Charles Texier stumbled across massive walls and carved reliefs at a site later identified as Hattusa. He marveled at the scale of the city but had no idea who had built it. Later, scholars called the remains Syro-Hittite or Hatti, but the civilization's true identity remained hidden. Everything changed at the turn of the 20th century. German archaeologists Hugo Winkler and Theodor Macready uncovered thousands of clay tablets at Hattusa, inscribed in cuneiform. At first, scholars assumed the language was Akkadian or Hurrian. But in 1915, Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný made a breakthrough that reshaped history. He noticed that words in the texts resembled Indo-European languages. For example, water, meaning water, echoed the German Wasser and English water. Hrozný proved that Hittite was not only Indo-European, but the oldest recorded branch of that language family. His discovery not only solved the mystery of the Hittites, but also revolutionized our understanding of European and Near Eastern linguistic history. From those tablets, an entire lost world re-emerged. Treaties, laws, myths, diplomatic letters, and religious rituals revealed that the Hittites had been a true superpower, standing alongside Egypt and Babylon. What once seemed a minor biblical footnote became an empire with a thriving capital at Hattusa, powerful queens like Putuhepa, and military campaigns that shook Syria and Mesopotamia. From the shadows of oblivion, they stepped back into the light of archaeology and history. The rediscovery of the Hittites raised profound new questions. Who first mastered iron? Who created the earliest international peace treaties? And how could a great empire vanish so completely from collective memory? Each question spurred new research, linguistic, archaeological, even climatic, until the Hittites became a key to understanding the entire late Bronze Age collapse. Today, Hattusa is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors can walk through its stone walls, pass beneath the Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate, and stand before the carved deities of Yazilikaya. What was forgotten for millennia now stands as a living monument to a civilization once equal to the most famous names of antiquity. Museums in Ankara, Istanbul, Berlin, and London display Hittite tablets and reliefs, giving the modern world a glimpse into the face of the lost empire. The recovery of Hittite memory carries a wider lesson. It reminds us that history is never complete. The pages we think are finished may still be missing chapters, and empires we imagine gone forever can reappear from the soil. More importantly, it shows how fragile human memory truly is. Even a superpower can vanish within centuries, leaving only faint traces that take millennia to uncover. The Hittites, then, are not just an archaeological subject. They are a mirror. They show us that power and greatness do not guarantee permanence. Only what is preserved, in writing, in stone, in memory, can carry a civilization through the darkness of forgetting and back into humanity's story. When we look back at the story of the Hittites rising from a small Anatolian tribe to a superpower equal to Egypt and Babylon, only to vanish from memory for 2,000 years, we don't just see history, we see a mirror reflecting the fragility of every civilization. The Hittites once had it all: superior iron weapons, chariots that thundered across the battlefield, a legal system more progressive than many of their rivals, a religion that absorbed and adapted, and an enormous archive of written culture. They signed the world's earliest surviving international peace treaty with Egypt. They controlled the trade networks that kept the Bronze Age alive, and yet all of it collapsed within just a few generations. The first lesson is about nature. The Hittites could forge iron swords and build mighty walls, but they could not command the rains or keep their soil fertile forever. When the climate shifted, when drought dragged on and harvests failed, the empire crumbled. This is not only a story from 3,000 years ago. Today, humanity faces global climate change, and the Hittites remind us that no power, no matter how great, can stand outside the laws of nature. The second lesson lies in connection. The Hittites became a superpower not only through conquest, but through their place in the global network of the Bronze Age, exchanging tin, horses, wine, ivory, signing treaties, marrying into foreign dynasties, and preserving the myths of many cultures. But the very connections that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. When ports like Ugarit fell, when the Sea Peoples cut off trade routes, the Hittites plunged into crisis. In a world increasingly bound together, prosperity and collapse often come hand in hand. The Hittites show us both sides of early globalization. It could lift a people to greatness, but also drag them down when the system broke. The third lesson is internal. Even with laws to govern succession, the Hittites were plagued by palace rivalries, rebellious vassals, and deep social divides. Brilliant kings like Suppiluliuma I could paper over these cracks, but they never disappeared. When outside crises struck, the fractures inside widened, and the empire could no longer hold. This is a timeless truth. The greatest danger to a civilization is often not the enemy outside, but the weakness within. And finally, there is the lesson of memory. The Hittites vanished from human awareness for over 2 millennia, remembered only faintly in the Bible. If not for the clay tablets of Hattusa, if not for the persistence of archaeologists and linguists, we might never have known them as a real empire. Their story reminds us that history is not a finished book, but a tapestry full of holes, waiting to be rediscovered and rewoven. Today, when we walk among the ruins of Hattusa, through the Lion Gate, or beneath the carved gods of Yazilikaya, we feel the breath of an empire long gone. They ruled, they allied, they created laws and culture, they shaped myth, and then they disappeared. But their disappearance makes their rediscovery all the more meaningful, giving us the chance to learn from both their triumphs and their failures. The Hittites leave us with a message. True strength does not lie in eternal survival, but in the legacy a civilization leaves behind. And in that sense, they succeeded. Across the millennia, their culture, their laws, their myths, and their lessons still echo, reminding us of both the fragility and the resilience of humankind in the endless flow of history.